Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for the teachers who are here. I know you've had a long day, and you're doing extra time on top of that, so thanks for being here. We're very excited to have our own portal to iCivics. How many here in the room have ever done iCivics on your own? Sort of, you've tried it out. Okay. Well, we were approached by iCivics last year, or maybe it's the year before that, to have our own portal. We're the second state in the country to have that after Ohio. And so with the funding from Google, we were able to arrange for that and to develop lessons that we thought would really help our Washington teachers with local content. And this WE is the Council on Public Legal Education, which I've been a part of for over 20 years. And its mission is to help all the people who live in the state of Washington know what their rights and responsibilities are. We took on 2 years ago a civic learning initiative, and I'm the lead for that. There's certain elements in it that I'll mention. We had a summit to kick it off in 2017. We had our next summit that had Justice Sotomayor present. Some of you who are in the room were present for that. And then we launched iCivics Washington. This is the first webinar we've had in iCivics Washington. It's being recorded. We'll make it available on YouTube. We won't show the answer sheet parts of the iCivics lesson, so your students won't be able to get to that. But if you want to go back and look at it or see how something worked, you can do that. They're hot links. You can go back and log on. We also have our 2 local partnerships, and again, Sunnyside and Franklin Pierce agreed to join with us, and super support from the school districts. And then a third piece of our local partnerships is making sure that we involve the community in doing civic education with kids, so that it's not just the school's responsibilities, but bring in what those both cultural communities and civic after-school programs can help. And I know David Beard is on this webinar with us, who does the out-of-school programming statewide. I also wanted to then thank our funders. I should say we also were instrumental in getting through a law through the legislature this last March. It required the standalone civics class, which I'm sure you've all heard about if you're teaching, especially at the high school level. It establishes professional development. They're collecting and creating an open educational resource data bank, establishing the partnerships as part of that law. And then the OSPI is taking over History Day. We also have a media campaign to get the word out. And we want to make sure that we have articles and efforts out that get people focused on the need for civic learning. I think this is a time in history when people are saying, is democracy going to survive? If the recent polls show that 51% of adults have faith in democracy. That's 51%. We're almost less than half. So, and I'm not saying anything about our current political situation. I'm just, in terms of who's who, I'm just saying it's the reality about when institutions of government are being challenged for their authenticity and their legitimacy, we have an obligation to act, and that is what's behind our effort. So we wanted to thank also our funders who made this happen, and that would be Google, which donated a substantial amount of money to create the portal, and then PEMCO, the insurance company that has funded this specific webinar. I'd like to also then just briefly introduce, we were able to get the Justice Debra Stephens to join us for this. She has been on our state Supreme Court since 2008. She has, as part of her job duties, to decide, you know, is the Constitution violated, both the U.S. or the Washington state, or what happens when both are involved. And she's also taught both the U.S. Constitution and the state Constitution at Gonzaga Law School. So we have a real expert, someone who brings a lot of prestige to our presentation here today, and she's open to questions which are built into the webinar when we get into the specific lesson we're focusing on, which is comparing the Washington Constitution with the US Constitution. Christina, back to you.
So you've heard a little bit about the Washington Partnership that we are so grateful to have at iCivics, but I wanted to just give you a little bit more background about our organization. So we were founded in 2009 by Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor with the mission of bringing a high-quality civic education to every student in the United States. And so we are making progress, but our goal is to reach 10 million students, and we're pushing hard to meet that goal. I want to dive into the iCivics Washington portal and give you all the opportunity to see all of the additional resources that are available to you all due to the work of so many wonderful people in Washington. So I encourage you to pull up now the iCivics Teach Hub. That is iCivics.org/teachers/Washington. It should come up for you automatically if you are registered as a Washington teacher when you press that green Teach button. This will give you access to the Washington portal, which includes that scrolling bar that you see at the top. You can click on the iCivics Washington scope and sequence. Actually, let me go ahead and switch my screen so that I can show you all what exactly you'll see when you go onto the Washington Teach Hub. So you can scroll through this bar right here, and it'll show you a summary of state partners and some other helpful resources that will help you in your civic teaching. So those are all linked here. I encourage you to check them out later. But the real document that will help you see everything that you have access to through iCivics Washington is this scope and sequence. And this has an overview of all of our resources. We'll go through this information later and highlight some of our most popular resources. But you can see our unit breakdown and all of the resources we have available for every civic topic. So from foundations of government to the road to the Constitution, a growing nation, civil rights, all the way down to one that I want to highlight specifically, which is state and local government, which is where you'll find this Comparing Constitutions Washington lesson plan that we're going to look at today. And then for our state and local government high school, you'll also see some of the other lesson plans that are available. So this is really going to be the document you want to refer back to when you're building out your plans for the year, when you're thinking about how you can really cover all of the standards. And within this, you'll see those specific Washington resources that you want to highlight. So scrolling back over to the main page of the Teach Hub, the very first unit you will see here is the curriculum unit. And if you click on that, it will show you the 4 lesson plans that are available that are specific to Washington State. So the one we're going to look at more closely is Comparing Constitutions, but we also have a lesson on Washington's water. You also have Governing Washington Communities, which talks about the different layers of government within Washington. And also citizen power, so how students can navigate those levels of government and really get involved on a local and a state level. And there's also the initiative and referendum lesson plan, which is mentioned in Comparing Constitutions. So if you use Comparing Constitutions, it goes over well. You think your students are ready for a deeper dive into initiative and referendum, I would encourage you to check out that lesson plan next and build off the learning that you're able to do with the Comparing Constitutions lesson plan. So I am going to press download right here. This is how you'll want to access this lesson plan. And if you press the download button, it'll pop up. I'm not going to hang out a lot on those teacher guide pages because I want to make sure that we are protecting the integrity of our resources and that your students can't access those answers if they happen upon this video on YouTube. But I'm going to start with our teacher guide. So every lesson plan has a teacher's guide. I'm going to talk a little bit about how this lesson plan is similar but different to our other iCivics lesson plans. Because this is such a complex topic and something that students generally don't have a lot of familiarity with, we've taken steps to break down this lesson plan and to provide readings and then immediate opportunities to practice through activities. Most of our other lesson plans will have 2 or more pages of student reading, depending on the level. Our middle school lessons have 2-page readings followed by activities. But like I said, in this lesson plan, they're really more integrated into the text. So our teacher's guide has some important things to take a look at. The first is going to be the handout section, and this will help you be prepared for class. It'll let you know what you need to prepare ahead of time, what materials you need, what printouts you might need. A lot of our lesson plans actually have fillable PDFs that are available to be downloaded. You can also download those through our Teach Hub. This lesson plan, though, because of what I mentioned with the complexity and the text comparisons, really works best printed out. So I would recommend, if at all possible, that you go ahead and print out this lesson plan. If you have older students or students who are more comfortable with technology and really good at using PDF readers, if that's something you do all the time in your classroom, then it might be okay to have students fill this out digitally and submit it. But if that's not the case, then I would definitely suggest that you print it out for your students. Or you can put it up on a projector and have students follow along with paper or complete it as a group if you have a smart board. And then we have the objective section, and that's where you'll look to make sure that you are hitting the standards that have been designated for your course. I encourage you to really look at the step-by-step. I think it includes a lot of good information that is easy to skip over. But for example, here we have a suggestion for an anticipatory activity and a closing activity. And those might be transferable depending on the lesson plan into a bell ringer or an exit ticket that you can do with your students. And here we also have some suggestions for diving deeper into the content. We have the entire text of the Washington State Constitution linked. So you can pull that up, look at it quickly with students, help them realize, the level of complexity and the length of the document so that they can get a real appreciation for the Constitution. And we also have an amendment ballot measures link that shows all of those ballot measures for all 83 amendments to Washington's Constitution. Well, the proposed amendments, so not all of them were passed. But this will allow students to compare similar statistics with the United States Constitution, and again get an appreciation for all of the transformation that's gone into the document. So, do we have any questions about this teacher's guide before I move on? All right, I don't see any, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to the first page of the student reading. So this page really briefly explains that there are 2 constitutions, the Washington Constitution, the federal Constitution, and why that's the case. In the government's rules section, it defines the purpose and the jurisdiction of the Washington Constitution and explains what's required of state governments by the US Constitution and where Washington had the opportunity to take some liberties in the design. And this page really sets the stage for the future comparison and contrast that you'll talk about between Washington, the United States Constitution, and to have conversations about rights and the structure of the three branches that's all outlined in the Washington Constitution. So one thing that I do want to mention before moving on is that background is going to be really important for this lesson plan. And so luckily, iCivics has a lot of resources about the federal Constitution. We have Do I Have a Right, for example, that can help your students review by using either the Bill of Rights edition or the full edition that covers all of the amendments to the US Constitution. And that will give them some good context when they're reviewing this lesson plan. So if you think that your students need a little bit of extra review or background knowledge, I'd encourage you to use our Teach Hub and check out the Road to the Constitution and the Constitution units. So moving on, we have the comparison activity of the preamble to the US Constitution and the state constitution. So this is going to be a really good place to start because most students are familiar with the preamble to the US Constitution. Thanks to Schoolhouse Rock, a lot of them can sing it. And it'll allow them to see what they already know, to get their feet wet, to feel more comfortable with the material, and hopefully immediately recognize some similarities between the US Constitution and the Washington State Constitution. So moving on, we dive deeper here into the individual rights for the next 3 pages. It starts with a short reading that just explains why many of the rights from the Bill of Rights are restated in the Washington Constitution. And it also explains that state governments usually offer more rights through their constitutions, and that's certainly true of Washington State. So for the next section, we're looking at the Declaration of Rights, and this is where students are first introduced to the concept of an amendment at the state level. So they learn that rights have changed and they've been added as time has progressed. This activity allows students to compare the framing of rights under the Declaration of Independence, the US Constitution, and the Washington Constitution. This is a really great opportunity that you'll have to highlight that the text of the US Constitution doesn't include many guarantees of individual rights, and that those rights are actually highlighted more closely in the Bill of Rights in the amendments to the Constitution. Here we have the rest of the pages that identify, those rights. I think that on this page, in this activity, you really get an idea of the incredible scope of the rights that are made available through the Washington Constitution, and not to forget about those rights that aren't listed in the Declaration of Rights. In the More Articles, More Rights section, we review some additional important critical rights like education and equality on the basis of sex. So in our next page, we have the Washington Legislative Branch, and students are asked to draw a diagram that shows the additional influence that citizens are allowed in the state of Washington thanks to the initiative and referendum rights that they have. So students can express that by creating a flowchart. And then we have an activity that shows, all of the other executive branch members who are designated by the Washington Constitution. An activity that talks a little bit about how, unlike the U.S. Constitution, the Washington Constitution allows people power in the judicial branch, and that judges are elected to 6-year terms. And then the next page, we have layers of government that talks about the levels of government that are created by the Washington Constitution, and whose power comes from where, so who's in charge of designating those counties and those cities. And then on the final page, we compare the process of amending the US Constitution and the Washington Constitution, and students are again asked to summarize the Washington process in a flowchart. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the Comparing Constitutions case studies, which are a wonderful resource for extending learning around this lesson plan. So this introduces some of what students have already seen in the lesson plan. It'll be a good review to start from the beginning. But the ones that I want to focus on are these slides 5 and 6, because I think that it can be a little complicated to understand, and it's certainly something that's a little complicated for students to wrap their mind around. And I wanted to give the justice an opportunity to share her insight, and for you all as teachers who might be using this lesson in your classroom to ask any clarifying questions. So this first slide talks about how it's handled if someone is claiming that their rights were violated under both the state and the federal constitution. And slide 6 is outlining the questions that the State Supreme Court of Washington will ask, what 6 factors they'll consider if they're thinking about whether a right should be interpreted the same way that a U.S. constitutional right is interpreted or differently. So I will go ahead and recognize folks to ask questions of the justice at this time. I'll give her the opportunity to speak, and it would just be wonderful if she could talk a little bit about what is most critical for students to learn about the Constitution, about this process, about their rights as a citizen of the state of Washington.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions immediately, so I'll jump in first. And I thank you for inviting me to speak to this. I want to provide just a little context for why you're seeing, for example, these 6 considerations that the court will look at, and why this is an issue in cases. And I think the real takeaway and what students need to understand is that when you live in an individual state, you're obviously entitled to the laws of that state, including constitutional rights. And of course, you're within the United States, so you're entitled to the protections of the laws of the United States. So it sort of matters which court a person might find herself in, or who is, arresting or prosecuting a person if it's a criminal case. Obviously, if a matter is investigated and someone's arrested by a federal officer and they're being prosecuted in federal court, then they're going to be talking about their federal rights. But most cases happen in state court, or they involve state law enforcement in the criminal context, or state actors, whether it be government actors or people who are acting with a privilege that they're granted under state law. And so they're going to have their state rights. So it's pretty common that states will grant more protection to individuals than the federal Constitution grants. And some of that happens just because of the way the courts have interpreted the protections. So like free speech protections or protections against search and seizure. It really comes out of court cases that differentiate between the levels of individual protection. And that's why these 6 criteria or 6 factors that you see here matter. Is what states were trying to do, and Washington is among them, is just not make it up as they go along, so to speak, but to really have a principled way to say why a provision in the Washington Constitution is different from something that addresses a similar issue and is in the United States Constitution or in the Bill of Rights. So that's why we tend to look at these factors. They are, so it's questions students should ask. You know, if they're looking at like the First Amendment and then Article 1, Section 5 of the Washington Constitution, they could look at the language and how it differs. What courts will look at is the history of how rights have been recognized under those provisions. When it says pre-existing state law, that can be going back to the time of our Constitution in 1889. You know, how were these matters handled in court? And then also whether there are issues of local concern versus national concern. And so, like one example we're going to do here in a moment, I think it's a searching of the garbage case, and that's one where local concern was addressed. But anyway, I'll stop there and let people ask questions if they have them, but it might even make more sense when we see a couple of examples. But I'll stop for now.
Does anyone have any questions? Margaret, are there any questions there at the school? All right, well, I will go ahead and put up one of the case studies then to look at. And so this is really, I think, a wonderful example of how you can illustrate this to students and make it a bit less abstract. So this case study gives a really pretty straightforward scenario about how this citizen, Brad, was putting his trash out for pickup, and the police actually retrieved the trash and they brought it to the station, and he was, he was charged with drug-related charges, drug distribution, but Brad actually claimed that these searches were illegal. So there are different rights, some under the Washington Constitution and some under the U.S. Constitution that are in question here. And the resolution ended up being that Brad was protected under the Washington Constitution, but the search actually would have been lawful under the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So in this case, Brad has more protections as a citizen of the state of Washington.
Let me comment on this one. So this is built on an actual case, and the person, just to put it in context, the reason they were interested in his trash is because he was forging prescriptions and selling legend drugs that way. And so they wanted evidence in the trash. And some of what what would be the difference between the state constitution and the federal constitution is first textually, because Article 1, Section 7 has a specific guarantee of privacy. It says a person shall not be disturbed in his private affairs. The Fourth Amendment doesn't expressly protect privacy or define private affairs. It just protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. So the court explained that the heart of the Fourth Amendment is really balancing what's reasonable and what's not reasonable, and what would a person really expect. After all, he threw out the trash. Did he really expect it to be private? And there is a federal case involving trash that says once you put it out in the can, you must not want it anymore, and you don't reasonably expect it to be left alone. Washington looked at, obviously I mentioned the textual difference in the actual protection of privacy, but also looked at the fact that in Washington we've long had statutes or city level ordinances about trash collection, and that a person would reasonably expect here that when you put it in the trash, the only person who's going to pick it up is the garbage man, and not your neighbor, or even less so a police officer. And so found that that was still you still had a protected interest in that. So it's a good example that rests on both the text of the provision as well as some local state history and areas of concern in how garbage collection is done. Where this case, the same notion comes up more immediately, and where we're having a lot of case law now is obviously involving cell phones, and what does a person expect with if they leave a phone behind, or if they send a text message, or that sort of thing. But the same concepts apply.
One thing that I would really suggest with this lesson plan is that you can integrate it with our game, Do I Have a Right? Because in a way, the questions that your clients are coming into your legal office with in Do I Have a Right are in many ways case studies. And so that's a really good way to introduce this to your students, for them to review either the Bill of Rights edition or the full edition, and then to compare and contrast what they're seeing in the Washington case studies with what they've seen in the Do I Have a Right game. Or if you want to extend learning from those case studies, you can then have the students play Do I Have a Right and discuss the different scenarios, both in the context of the federal Constitution and within the context of the Washington Constitution. Thanks to everyone for attending. If you have follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. My email is there, christina.wiley@icivics.org. Amber's email is there as well, and so is Margaret's. But we really hope that you will, create a teacher account, access all of those wonderful Washington resources that are available to you. Follow us on social media to hear what's new and what's next, and to use the hashtag iCivicsWashington to bring awareness among your fellow teachers to all of the wonderful resources that are available to them